Does William Loader jump to assumptions too quickly? Hi, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is Millennial Harbinger channel.
And here we go.
Okay, so it's been a while since we've made our last video. Couple months, it feels like. And I wanted to talk about this one article that's recently published. I say recently, but it's been since 2017, so almost 10 years, by William Loader, who is a pretty prominent voice in the discussion of same-sex sexual relationships in Christianity. Are they sinful? Are they not? Etc. And his article is Reading Romans 1 on Homosexuality in Light of Biblical Jewish and Greco-Roman Perspectives of Its Time. ZNW 2017. It's about, 30 pages long. And you can find this for free online at academia.edu, I believe. Now, here's how his article is organized. There's an introduction, obviously, and then he gives an example of a bad affirming argument. He has a problem with pretty much every affirming argument of Romans 1. We're gonna see that in this video. But in sections 2 through 11, he gives his own reading of Romans 1, which focuses heavily on Paul making a psychological argument where he's not just saying, hey, the behavior's bad, but also thinking that way is bad too. And in section 12, he then kind of concludes saying, here's all the misreadings of Romans 1, affirming and non-affirming. And he gives some conclusions in section 13. Here's an interesting quote. I think this is like the entirety, actually, of what he has to say in the introduction, and I wanted to share it. He says, in relation to those few verses in Romans 1 where Paul condemns homosexual relations, chapter 1, 24 through 28, it is extraordinary that what for him in the first century and for the recipients of his letter in Rome was the least controversial of themes, and indeed the reason why he uses it, has become in the 21st century one of the most controversial, especially for those whose understanding of scriptural authority entails believing that biblical writers were always correct in what they said and what they assumed. For those of us whose understanding of scriptural authority does not entail such belief, we can only stand and wonder at the extraordinary maneuvers which have been undertaken to reread Paul as not condemning homosexual relations at all. Really interesting quote there. Now, what does that introduction mean? What is he communicating from the very get-go? Here's a few thoughts. Loader believes Paul does condemn homosexual behavior in Romans 1, 24 through 28, but does not believe it is wrong today. All right? He's going to make, in the end, an affirming argument, but his reading of Romans 1 is basically non-affirming. Again, we'll explain when we get farther along. Another observation from the introduction, Loader notes the irony between how homosexual behavior was the least controversial topic for Jewish Christians in the first century, compared to being the most controversial today. It's a really good observation. Third, Loader believes it is wrong to assume a view of scriptural authority that believes the biblical writers were always correct in what they said and assumed, all right, which serves as legitimation of his stance. Let's read that again. Loader believes it is wrong to assume a view of scriptural authority that believes the biblical writers were always correct in what they said and assumed, which serves as legitimation of his stance, which he says, hey, we don't have to assume what they assumed, and it's okay, which allows him, gives him the freedom to kind of make or have any belief he wants, but particularly an affirming stance on same-sex sexual behavior as Christians. And the final observation, Loader believes this outdated understanding of scriptural authority has caused affirming Christians to make bad arguments in Romans 1. All right, so he's like, hey, look, Paul's against it in Romans 1, and every affirming theologian or writer who says that Romans 1 is not saying that, they're making some pretty bad arguments. And so William Loader is a very interesting character and theologian today for both sides, particularly the non-affirming side. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. So here is his example of a bad affirming argument or bad reading of Romans 1 in the first section of his article after the introduction. Okay, so basically, he sums up this argument as Paul wasn't serious, where Paul basically plays a big psych on his readers, where he's like, I'm going to act like it's okay, or I'm going to act like it's wrong, but in reality, it's not wrong. I'm just kind of like doing a big old like gotcha for his readers. But Loder provides one example of a most extraordinary attempt based upon what he believes is the wrong view of scriptural authority. And he cites three different theologians and their publications. Those authors are Countryman, Helminiak, and Hanks. Basically, Paul's condemnation was a ploy only to abandon it at the point when he turns on his hypocritical readers in chapter 2, verse 1. So same-sex relations become much like circumcision and food laws and Sabbath observance. They're to be abandoned, right? So with this argument, Paul's argument is actually exactly the opposite of what is argued by non-affirming Christians today. Okay? So it seems like Paul is making an argument against it, but in reality, he's like, psych, no, not really. They're done away with in light of Jesus, just like Sabbath, food, and circumcision laws. So after giving that one example of a bad affirming reading of Romans 1, the Paul wasn't serious argument, here's a breakdown of what each section looks like in his explication, his reading of Romans 1 in sections 2 through 11. So he explains his approach, then he goes into Jewish and Christian tradition, then he talks about Paul and Gentile depravity, talks about the fall and psychology. And again, section 6, in terms of psychology, is kind of like an important section to understand the argument that he's trying to make here. In section 7, he talks about the passions, and then honor and shame culture in section 8, the nature and creation debate and argument. And then in section 10, the discussion about lesbianism mentioned in Romans 1. And then finally in section 11, like trying to bring it all together, a coherence of his argument. All right, so let's look at bit by bit throughout each section to see, in essence, what he says. I'm not going to cover everything, but I'm going to cover what sticks out in my mind. So here's Loder's approach in this quote. He says basically, I want to avoid the danger of monoderivative readings, where basically what that means is how we understand what Paul is saying here only comes from a Jewish background or only comes from a Greco-Roman background. He's like, no, it's not just one or the other. It's like what's the word I'm looking for? A conflux, if you will, of ideas. He says we want to avoid that. We want to avoid monoderivative readings, which suggest only one context plays a role, and instead consider the likelihood that a range of possible influences and echoes may be present in the text. Unless there are serious grounds for doing so, and in this case there are not, it makes little sense to impose false alternatives on our readings, as though Paul operated from either a Jewish background or a wider Hellenistic background. I think he's correct. I disagree with his conclusions in terms of his ultimate conclusion, affirming reading. But I think this general sentiment and approach in trying to understand what Paul's saying here in Romans 1 is like a general exegesis principle that you want to follow no matter where you're at in the Bible or any piece of literature, right? Okay. Here in section 3, he goes into a little bit of the Jewish and Christian tradition background. And I really like, this is like one of my favorite thoughts that he puts pen to paper on here in section 3. He says, Paul is standing in a long tradition which associates sexual immorality and idolatry. Okay, so there's a connection in Jewish thought, both in scripture and in intertestamental literature, extra biblical Jewish literature, right? We see this already in the way these Leviticus prohibitions are framed with reference to the idolatrous ways of the Canaanites and Egyptians in Leviticus 18, in the book of Leviticus overall. The Wisdom of Solomon similarly cites idolatry as the basis for sexual immorality. They're in chapter 13 through 14 of Wisdom of Solomon. Like Paul appealing to God's self-revelation in creation, which left people without excuse. Right? There's a lot of similarities and parallels between what Paul says in Romans 1 and Wisdom of Solomon. A lot of people have seen that. Okay, but here's what he says also. The tradition preserved in the Testament of Naphtali in chapters 3 and 4 links the judgment from heaven against the watchers and the people of Sodom on the grounds of perverted behavior, contrary to nature, on the basis of a perverted understanding of God and nature and its divine law. He doesn't keep digging there in that background, which I wish he would have done, because I think we need to do more digging there in this like relationship between idolatry and sexual morality and what was really going on in the ancient Jewish mindset to bring those two together, which I think the Enochian teleology of evil and that kind of undergirding foundational worldview can help us kind of explicate or get at this connection between idolatry and sexual morality and Paul's thoughts here in Romans 1. But I really like this thought here in section 3. Now, in section 4, in Paul and Gentile depravity, he takes the Gentile only view in Romans 1, where if you take the Gentile only view, predominantly it seems like you are going to come out with a affirming reading of Romans 1. All right. But I just wanted to note that's I saw that stand out in section 4. In section 6, skipping section 5, he talks about psychology and he talks about the motif of exchanging, which is a central feature of Paul's thought and argument in Romans 1, particularly exchanging what is true for what is false. And he says at one level, Paul is making a psychological argument about the mind, believing what is true, believing what is false, etc. The focus is on the state of mind which produces the actions. But he nowhere does he mention the Old Testament contextual background, such as Psalm 106 or Deuteronomy 4, from where this kind of idea of exchange comes from. All right. And he misses the metonymic language associated with the powers, where, again, associate also with this exchanged terminology. Okay. So I think that's significant to note that he doesn't observe those things going on within the text. In section 7, he talks about the passions in which humanity is handed over into, right? No significant discussion of the idea or terminology of handing over, God handing humanity over, or the Gentiles, in his mind, the Gentiles over into these passions. There's no contextual, again, no Old Testament contextual background discussion of Psalm 106 where handed over is used, or other passages in the Jewish tradition that use this terminology. And again, he misses the metonymic language of the passions for the powers, as argued by other scholars. Okay. And in section 11, skipping a few sections, he gives a really good summation of his argument. Again, and again, this is a non-affirming reading of Romans 1 where he's like, hey, Paul is actually speaking against same-sex sexual behavior for Christians in Romans 1. He takes the death penalty view in Romans 1:32 in light of Leviticus 20, verse 13, which is interesting. We made a video, I don't know, a little while back where it's like perhaps it's not in reference to the death penalty of Leviticus 20 for entering into a same-sex sexual behavior relationship. Rather, instead, it's more metonymic language. But yeah, so interesting argument that I really appreciate Loder's scholarship as well as everything he's done on this subject in the past, 20 years? It's really great. He is definitely a theologian one must read if you're going to try to tackle this very difficult subject. Now in section 12, he gives what he calls the misreadings of Romans 1. And he lists at least 5 that I saw, 5 affirming misreadings. The first one is the pederasty or abusive forms only argument. And he references Scroggs there. He says that's a bad reading. All right. Number 2, the cultic only setting, where it's like this behavior is happening within like a temple, pagan temple context. And he cites Boswell. He's like, no, that's a bad affirming reading. That's a misreading. Number 3, it's the argument that says heterosexual men are acting contrary to their nature by entering into homosexual behavior. So it's not that the homosexual behavior is itself sinful, but it's like, no, you guys are, heterosexual, so you shouldn't be acting that way. You should stay heterosexual. Again, Boswell, he references there. He's like, that's a misreading. Number 4, he talks about the strength of their passions and not the direction, or the excessive lust view, which a lot of people like today, such as Vines and others. He's like, that's a misreading. Um, and number 5, the honor shame cultural lens, viewing the dishonorable as simply the being or making passive. So the problem is one of these two gentlemen or women in these same-sex sexual acts are being the passive partner, or particularly the men. A man is being made passive in the sexual act, and that is what's wrong in this honor, shame, and culture. So he's like, all 5 of these are misreadings. These affirming readings are wrong. Okay. Then he highlights one particular affirming or non-affirming reading, particularly the one made by Gagnon, where he's like, Paul limited his objection to the acting out of homosexual passions and only required celibacy. So he's like Gagnon by saying only the act is wrong, only the act is sinful, and not the thinking behind the acts. He's like, that's a misreading as well, because it's both the actions and the thoughts and mindset behind the actions as well. So he's like basically saying everybody's wrong. So here's some of his conclusions in section 13 at the end of his article. He says Paul's assumptions about the nature of creation, male and female, prohibitions, plus the danger of strong passions leading people astray in the wrong direction, and honor and shame measured by what pleases God, create the common ground and condemnation of same-sex behavior. So the basic assumption, he says, behind Paul's words here in Romans 1 are that human beings are male and female, that they're heterosexual, or heterosexual is the kind of like only way of being sexual, if you will, in terms of behavior, as God the Creator intended, and anything else is a distortion to serving condemnation. Okay, and Paul, he says as well, will have known and rejected the claim of natural homosexuality. Okay, he's like, these are the assumptions that Paul has in his mind that's causing him to say that same-sex sexual behavior is sinful and wrong. Okay, which then he will then say, we don't have to have the same assumptions as Paul.
Chairman, you want everyone going to the assumption it's perfectly safe here, don't you? Well, it's not.
Here's his final thought of the article and conclusion that, again, he kind of ends abruptly, but we kind of finally see his thinking come to the fore that leads him to a affirming reading of Romans 1. He's like, okay, one can read Paul with respect, even though one may disagree with his assumptions. As today, most people who do affirm that being gay is not a sign of perversion, whether they then still retain the validity of the Leviticus prohibitions or see them too as not applicable, as do I. Okay, so Paul had his assumptions. They're not applicable anymore. We don't have to hold on to his assumptions. Therefore, because we don't have to assume what he assumed, we can take an affirming reading or affirming understanding of same-sex sexual behavior today. Paul was not affirming in Romans 1, but despite that, we can be affirming today. That's kind of the gist of his argument.
I understood that reference.
So here are some of my observations after we've kind of gone through a brief kind of trying to explain the argument that Loder is making, as flawed as that was. All right. Here's some of my observations. First, Loder's view of scriptural authority itself is, you could say, disenchanted. I'm kind of overusing that term on this channel. I get it, but I still think that's the case, which understands Paul's assumptions to be wrong despite himself being an apostle, which is, man, it's just kind of crazy to think about. But that is a prevalent thought today, leading many people to an affirming reading, affirming understanding. Another observation, this view of scriptural authority is similar to the hermeneutical approach, which says, for one, that God changed his mind on this subject. Okay? Loder's view, it appears to me that Loder is saying Paul assumed it was wrong, but it really wasn't, and it isn't wrong, and we don't have to have the same assumptions as him. All right? The argument that is been put forward, such as by Hayes and Hayes recently, is that it was wrong. Paul was making a non-affirming argument in Romans 1, but it is no longer wrong in God's eyes. Okay? So I think there's a little bit of nuance here between the two, but they're kind of saying the same thing, just in a little bit different way.
No problem, no problem, no problem.
More observations. I think Loader aims to not be monoderivative, yes, or to consider all possible influences on Paul and not just one, which is great, but he doesn't observe the following textual elements, which creates another disenchanted, non-affirming reading of Romans 1 that we've been kind of lamenting as we've been going through each video in this channel, where we kind of cover sources, both conservative and liberal, or however you want to word that, on the subject. So what he doesn't observe is Psalm 106, the background of Psalm 106, where exchanged and handed over is used. The Deuteronomy 4 background, which is a top 4 Deuteronomy 32 worldview main text, right? The metonymic language, or the powers in general that we see present within this passage. Like supernatural evil is doesn't seem to be on his radar in Romans 1. He doesn't consult any of Heiser's works or similar material that Heiser consults in his scholarship in the Unseen Realm, etc. But even if he did look at all these things and observe all these things, it seems that this would all be thrown into the assumption box anyway. And so, again, it's hard to have a conversation perhaps today because of that very fact. Like, well, even if you make the best non-affirming argument that you can, it's like, hey, that's great. So what? We don't have to have the same assumptions as Paul did. So sorry. I don't know. That's how it feels. That's how it's coming across to me. Here's some more observations. Loader's attempt to avoid fundamentalistic readings of Romans 1, I think, ironically fails due to his take on scriptural authority, which leads to another fundamentalistic take. Our assumptions must align with apostolic assumptions. That doesn't seem to be a very controversial thought in my mind. That kind of seems to be kind of the point. The apostles continued the ministry of Jesus, and the Christians post-apostles are trying to do the very same thing. Okay? The Enochic teleology of evil and the divine counsel worldview that leads to the Hebraic view of sexual ethics is not a fundamentalistic assumption to be discarded, but rather the fundamental reality we live within that doesn't change. Made this argument in other videos as well.
It's a safe assumption.
A few more observations here. Orthodoxy is not fundamentalism. I think we need to make at least that clear. Because a lot of times, like, any non-affirming reading can be thrown into the box, fundamentalistic box, by affirming Christians today. Orthodoxy is not fundamentalism. Non-affirming readings of churches and Christians are not inherently fundamentalistic, right? But they can be, and some are. Like, there's some bad readings of Romans 1 walking around here, right? And we need to call those out, both affirming and non-affirming bad misreadings that Loader is calling out as well. All affirming readings of Romans 1, though, that Loader himself argues are fundamentalistic. And that's kind of funny, kind of ironic that he lets everybody have it in this article, but he especially lets the affirming theologians who try to make affirming arguments in Romans 1 have it, it seems, most of all in some ways, where he basically says, hey, look, all these affirming readings of Romans 1, they're ironically fundamentalistic. And yet it's weird how so many affirming writers, Christians, and theologians bring Loader on to their podcasts and to their YouTube channels to make the case. It just seems odd to me. He's like, he just called everybody fundamentalistic for how they're reading Romans 1, but they bring him on as if he didn't say that. I don't know. It just seems funny to me. Ignoring textual evidence can lead to fundamentalistic readings on both sides, though. and contribute to what Roger Olson calls folk religion. I think folk religion, in one of its kind of ways of thinking about it and approaching it, we're all susceptible to it, no matter where we come from, what angle, whether from the liberal side, conservative side, etc. This like disenchanted, affirming reading of Romans 1 seems to be an aspect of new folk religion in America today, in the world today.
That's a big Twinkie.
And one final thought here. Now, the Holy Post podcast had a discussion recently on fundamentalism. If you're not listening or watching the Holy Post podcast, I think you should. It's a really good podcast, right? And here's what they had to say, and I'm trying to sum it up in one slide here. They said what often happens in deconstruction stories is a swap from like right-leaning fundamentalism to left-leaning fundamentalism. This switch from evangelical, conservative, to evangelical, deconstructed, liberal Christian, right? And homosexuality, they say, is often a primary example in this swap that's made from non-affirming to affirming. While orthodoxy, I would argue, lies somewhere in between of this right fundamentalism, conservative fundamentalism, liberal fundamentalism, orthodoxy somewhere in between, that enchanted sexual ethic that considers and looks at same-sex sexual behavior as sinful in light of an Enochic teleology of evil, somewhere in between those two fundamentalisms. So those are my thoughts on this very important subject in light of Loder's great article. You should check it out for free, again, online, academia.edu, and give it a read. And I'm going to keep trying to put forward some good scholarship, free stuff especially, that we can find online to read to get a better understanding on this important subject, so we can have better conversations in our churches, and as well as love our LGBTQ brothers and sisters better on top of that. Okay, so guys, I'm done. I'm going to stop talking. Thanks for watching to the end. We'll see you next time. Bye.
And I stand by my performance.
He shall.